All right, good day, everyone. It's CJ, and it's that time of the week again for another Sirius report with London Paul. I want to thank all of our listeners for tuning in. Very excited. V will hopefully be joining us at some point. He had another appointment he needed to get to, so I'm very honored anytime that I get to do a show with London Paul. It's amazing the feedback that we get regarding the Sirius report, regarding the show, the amount of information, the insights that London Paul brings. I know that there's lots to talk about today, so I don't want to delay. So, London Paul, how are you, sir?
Well, good morning, CJ, and good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone listening. Yeah, I'm fine. And yourself?
I'm doing great. We had a good weekend. Always interesting things evolving, happening in the world. I know that it never gets old saying this, Paul, but it's a very exciting time to be alive right now.
Yeah, most definitely. We're going through a huge kind of transitional phase, and what we discuss each week is really a very small part. It's just try to cover off as many points, but without necessarily going into all the detail because we only have the hour. So, shall I get cracking then?
Yeah, let's get started. Let's fire it up and take us where you would like to go, Paul.
Okay, we'll cover off some stuff that's been recently. We had this uh, article, or I think there was some YouTube clips over the weekend talking about these Marines that had landed at Langley, and they were there to protect Trump, and some show of force because there was this belief there was a coup of rogue CIA operatives about to presumably storm the White House and dethrone Trump. Well, there's no concrete evidence to support these claims. I've spoken to a lot of people and nothing's come back with any substance. Now, I can't say definitively it's not the case, but from my perspective, I don't see any reason to hold any that this story holds any weight at this point in time. It doesn't mean that there's a backdrop to it that may have some, grain or more of reality and truth to it. But as far as I understand, there's no Marines landed at Langley. And this other point came back about that Hillary Clinton's got this boot on because she's being tagged. Well, for me, the boot story doesn't wash either. I mean, they're saying she's got a broken toe, and people say, well, you don't put a boot on for that. Well, why not just say then she's got a broken foot? Then you could put her foot in a boot. No one would think anything of it. Why give credence to a story by being medically incorrect? The reality is she just got a boot on her foot. They're not going to tag someone like Clinton, and then she just goes about her daily life. That's not how the process will work as and when adjudication or indictment happens. And tags aren't really conspicuous anyway, so she could just wear trousers with shoes. So once again, for me, the alternative media is jumping to conclusions, and it's not really doing itself any favors. Yes, there is a bigger story that's unfolding, but why look to embellish it with bits of information that, for me, don't really stand up to scrutiny? And I always look at that and say, okay, well, why bother? Why put someone a boot on someone's foot and invent a story when you have no need to? And why not embellish the story, like I said, and say, well, there's a broken foot, and then everyone go, yeah, that's normal. You just put a boot on the foot. But because there's all this indictment story going around, people naturally come to the conclusion, oh, well, it therefore means that there's nothing wrong with her foot, and therefore she's being tagged, and it's all part of, and it fits that narrative. Well, the narrative doesn't need additional things to give it credence. There's certainly enough substance from my perspective, and I'm not saying it involves Clinton or doesn't involve Clinton, but to do with sealed indictments, and we're starting to go through this process of draining the swamp in inverted commas. But why add these bits of additional information that actually really don't add anything? But it's great clickbait, and people love these stories, but it doesn't really add anything from my perspective at all.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. There's so much information, and anymore, Paul, anytime that I see a headline, people are in such a rush nowadays to be the first, to get the most amount of views, to draw the attention to. And I saw that as well. That started trending. I believe it was on Saturday. I started seeing that, regarding the potential of a Langley incident, regarding the Marines. So much information that you do have to pause for a moment through these times to do a little bit of research to try to validate some of these findings. And it could be also just a concentrated effort to get disinformation out there.
Well, yeah, there is always that risk, and I'm not suggesting anyone's doing that. But then there was another story that came out that there'd been this huge explosion at Langley. Well, if that was the case, there's no way the media would hide this. And and let's face it, the other point is that if there was anything like this going on and there was some coup attempt, the mainstream media is not going to not report this because they'll spin it in a way, in any which way, how it's required. It's not going to be this news blackout, and then we suddenly find Trump's no longer in the White House. So yeah, I agree completely. And in fact, ironically, we had another story that broke to do with the Rothschilds, which it just staggered me that what was a simple story got blown completely out of proportion. But let's talk about it. There was obviously this plane and helicopter crash. Now, 4 people were killed in this mid-air collision between this helicopter and light aircraft flying from an airfield. Now, interestingly, of course, where the airfield was, the air traffic control had been shut there due to staff shortages. Now, there was this big elaborate story about the Rothschilds. Now, first off, the wreckage from the aircraft landed over a mile from what is called Waddesdon Manor in Buckinghamshire, which everyone attributes as being the home of the Rothschild banking dynasty, etc. Well, we'll come to that point in a minute. There's a busy flight path over this estate, so it's hardly surprising that this happens. It's not a regular occurrence, but where I used to live, we had 3 instances like this that happened in the space of about 6 months. And sometimes these things happen. But here's the killing point of all this. And what people don't realize is Waddesdon Manor was bequeathed by the Rothschilds to the National Trust. And no Rothschild has lived there in over 60 years. It's open to the public. I've been there. You can go and visit it. You can go and visit the grounds, go and visit inside the big house. No Rothschild lives there. So why did this whole story suddenly become, oh, Jacob Rothschild's dad? It's just, there's no credence to it. And again, I watched it and it just blew out of proportion. It was everywhere. There was discussion. There was YouTube clips. There was alternative site. Jacob Rothschild doesn't live there. And that's as simple as that. He hasn't. And just because it crashed a mile away, suddenly it becomes Jacob Rothschild's dad. And there's just no substance to it. And again, it doesn't do the alternative media any favors because there's people out there, a lot of great people trying to get solid, reliable content out. These stories break, and it's very damaging for everybody in the process because everybody gets tarnished with the same brush. Oh, alternative media. Look at the sensational stories and headlines they produce. But there's no substance to it. And the fact is they haven't lived there in over 60 years. So, and people probably aren't aware of that, but that's reality. That's a fact.
Right, right. Well, and there was also the rumor speculation in regards to, George Soros, that George Soros was already dead, and lo and behold, Nancy Pelosi and Soros just spent 3 days together at the Democracy Alliance here recently. So again, as much as I truly want to believe, in fact, I do feel the good guys, are winning. However, when it comes to the information, I mean, we have to be very careful about that. We have to be very sensitive regarding the information, and primarily because there could be a concentrated effort to discredit the alt media. And I hate to call ourselves the alt media. I think we are truly the truth media, the new media, and there's going to be a concentrated effort to discredit us, giving them more ammunition, London Paul, to remove us from YouTube, remove us from broadcasting, all these things that potentially could happen with the result of sharing false information.
Yes, there's always that risk, and you absolutely highlight it perfectly. And Soros is a great example. I think in the last 5 years, the amount of times I've heard people stating Soros is dead or something, and then literally a week later he's seen somewhere in public at some big huge function or some forum or some meeting or whatever it is, and it just discredits it. And it doesn't help the alternative, or as you say, the truth media, or the media of the future. And that's why I get a lot of people sending me stuff going, you need to look at this. And truthfully, I largely will spend 2 minutes, go through it, and within 2 minutes I'll know from my perspective whether it's worth watching all of it or not watching it. But I tend to avoid watching a lot of it because it just doesn't have the substance. And it does detract away from the great amount of people, and there are a lot of great people out there trying to get the truth out, discuss things in a coherent manner that, you know, presents facts and discuss or presents, you know, tangible debate, and that's something that these kind of stories do lack. And and it kind of got me thinking a bit more about the kind of Rothschilds in general. Now, there's a huge amount given over to the Rothschilds, and historically, it's irrefutable their role in global affairs. That is without question. And I know what I'm going to say now. There's going to be people out there. I can see the comments written already. This guy's a Rothschild sympathizer, and he's downplaying the Rothschilds deliberately. Well, I'm not. I'm going to say something that's factually correct. Yes, the Rothschilds have influence, but it's overblown, and as you know, and it's self-evident they don't have the influence that they once did on a world stage. But the media loves to indulge things associated with the past when they did have prominence. The idea that the Rothschilds control all these central banks is not true. It doesn't mean they don't have an influence, but central banks are not centrally controlled by, they're all centrally controlled by different individuals and different groups of people on a nation by nation basis. And if the Rothschilds were that dominant as people think, why did the EU ever come into existence? Because they vehemently opposed it. Now, if they had the power and influence, they would have been able to stop that happening. And the UK had to fudge its failure of the Maastricht Treaty guidelines to avoid having to ditch the pound and embrace the euro. They fudged it. They didn't just go, we're not doing it, and that's not happening. And also, of course, the EU was a Bush construct, sort of at the back end of World War II, when obviously Nazism fell, because ultimately, what's the difference between what the Nazis were trying to do and the EU was trying to do? And then there's the whole idea that the Rothschilds were in control of the creation of the petrodollar. Well, there's a whole backstory historically about why the petrodollar came about, and I thought now was a good time to put this in, because it will surprise people, I think, quite a lot, because it didn't come about by design. What basically happened is the French, ironic of all people, forced the US off the gold standard. And they had to come up with an alternative, which later became the petrodollar. Now, what happened is the French had accumulated vast amounts of US dollars in Vietnam. Now, de Gaulle, who despised the US, despised Americans, went to Washington and said, right, I don't want to dump all my dollars, and demanded gold. And the truth is, the US simply did not have the gold, so Nixon was forced to take the US off the gold standard. Now, the irony is, the question is, why would the cabal ever want to go off the gold standard? Because it's the sheer irony. Going off the gold standard is what has ultimately destroyed the cabal, because it produced fiat currency, which has been the death of them. Whilst people say, well, they've greatly benefited from it, it's also ultimately destroyed them, as witnessed by what happened in 2008, which is part of the problem. But historically, we know for the last 40 years what fiat currency has done. And of course, ultimately, greed will always get the better of people and ultimately destroys them. That's what's happened to the cabal. But that is a factual account of why the petrodollar came about. It wasn't the cabal sitting there scheming, going, well, let's dump the gold standard and introduce the petrodollar. They had no choice. And what does it also prove? How did the French and de Gaulle manage to go to the US, demand gold for dollars, and kill the gold standard and force the petrodollar? That doesn't imply to me that the idea that there's these omnipotent, all-powerful families individually who control things. That is largely part of the illusion. There's no doubt these families exist. There's no doubt they wield power and influence. But a lot of it was an illusion to give the idea that they had this total power. And when Russia and China turned around and went, enough's enough, we're not putting up with it anymore, they've largely done what they wanted to do unopposed, and the West has not been able to stop them. I mean, yeah, they tried to economically destroy Russia. It backfired and blew up in their face. They certainly didn't want China to roll out the One Belt, One Road, and the rest of history in the last 10 years or so is self-evident. So, yeah, I'm not saying the Rothschilds don't have influence, and certainly they had massive influence, particularly prior to World War II and during. But after that period, their influence isn't as strong as people imagine. But it's another thing that dominates the alternative media. But we've just given a small example as to how it's not that simple. It's far more complicated. And it's just not a question of a few rival big families fighting out for power and influence. And of course, the one thing is the Bushes and the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds don't get on at all. They despise each other. Well, the Rothschilds particularly despise the Bushes and the Rockefellers because they see them as what they call nouveau riche, latter day wannabes coming on the scene and dominating with power and money and influence. But historically, of course, we know that what the Rothschilds did is irrefutable. We know that. I mean, they dragged out World War One. They were responsible for overthrowing the Russian Tsars and creating the Russian Revolution. That is all factually true. There's no doubt in history they were responsible, but certainly at some point post World War II, their influence started to diminish to some extent, and hence why the European Union came into existence. Because if they'd have had the power and influence, they would never have been out. They would never have allowed it. It would never have come to fruition, and that's why they kept the UK out of it, and why they refused to go in. And well, they kind of were coerced into joining as Britain was, but without adopting the euro in the process. But I thought it was interesting to mention some history that shines a very different light on what happened, or what was the factor that brought about the petrodollar.
Right. No, great insights, Paul. And I think in part, we're getting ready to go in the conversation regarding, at some point, regarding the EU and Angela Merkel.
Mm-hmm.
What about in particular with the United Nations and the efforts with the European Union? Did that have any influence at all from the cabal, from the globalists?
I think that, I mean, I can't profess to every aspect of what brought the EU into existence, but what, of course, absolutely happened was, Nazism failed. It didn't achieve its objective, which was exactly what the European Union now aspires to, which is centralized control. They wanted one single currency. Of course, history proved that the British, in part with the US and the sort of Western alliance, defeated Nazism, and the Russians for that matter, of course. So defeated Nazism, and it got put to bed. People all went back to the US. And then they spent 20 years going, well, how can we bring this about? Well, we're not going to be able to have another war. We're not going to have World War III and bring this about. So we'll call it the European Common Market. And everyone will buy that, but gradually we'll strip the edifice away and create the European Union. Now, the influence of the United Nations, I can't say definitively one way or the other. There's no doubt the United Nations was designed to achieve nothing but be obstructive, not resolve problems, and look to pass resolutions that would be deeply damaging to certain nations on the planet who didn't fulfill their objectives. But in no way, shape, or form is it ever designed, as they made out, well, it's to stop wars in the future. It's to get a global consensus on important matters. No, that's just a lie. And that's self-evident because we know the UN's done nothing but create problems and actually has resolved nothing.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Thank you for that. So continue, please, wherever you'd like to go. Sorry, I just wanted to bring that up because I thought the information that you were going over was just so important. So yeah, please continue.
Okay. Well, I guess I wrote a Twitter comment, and it provoked a bit of interest. And there was people who said, "Well, what do you mean?" And what I said was, we've always talked about this event-driven scenario as opposed to it being date-driven. It's not like on this date this will happen. I said, the event-driven scenario is moving at breakneck speed. The dominoes are lining up. Few have any idea what is coming, but the entire world will soon enough. Now, I should qualify, soon enough doesn't mean it's going to happen next week. But we are beginning to see this enormous convergence of events globally, and which suggests, as I say, these dominoes are being lined up. Because, I mean, Saudi Arabia, we'll talk in more detail again because there's more developments in that regard. Syria is another example where we've seen this dramatic change from an ISIS-Daesh caliphate to Syria virtually having total independence again from Daesh and ISIS. Iraq's another example. We've seen in the US where we've got all these sealed indictments, the kind of draining of the swamp. So I talked about it as being Plan B, and we're seeing that fold out. But I think in terms of these indictments, I call it, this is only my term, Operation Dragnet. Basically, there's going to be this enormous move to indict a whole bunch of people involved. And there's a lot of very familiar names and probably a lot of unfamiliar names. You see the US and the UK in this kind of economic meltdown. The wheels have fallen off with regards to their foreign policy in totality. I mean, there just isn't a foreign policy of any credible note. And then you mentioned Merkel, and it's a good point. We've got this, what I really now feel is a meltdown in the European Union. I mean, in Germany, they had these exploratory talks to form Germany's next coalition government. Now, that collapsed around midnight last night, sort of European time, when this pro-business free Democratic Party, the FDP, walked out of these negotiations that had gone on, I don't know, for a long time. And what they basically, there was these four partners who were going to form this coalition, and it transpired they've just got no common vision for modernization of the country, and there was no common basis of trust. This is what the FDP leader said. And they'd missed all these deadlines to resolve differences on migration and energy policy as two examples. And he basically came out and said it's better not to govern than to govern badly. But of course, what's the knock-on effect? This is hugely damaging to Merkel, and it's something we spoke about, that she has, you know, whilst the largest party, in these kind of elections, it's not like she has any majority, so they have to form these coalition governments. Well, that's not going to happen. So what's going to happen next? It's quite likely that Germany will have to go back and have another election. Now, what is the likelihood that Merkel might end up losing even more of the vote this time, because she's becoming more and more unpopular in Germany because of migration, because of the damage to German business through these ridiculous sanctions against Russia. And also Germany's foreign policy is deeply unpopular with many of the German people, and business, commerce and law have long since wanted an end to this subservience to Washington. So it remains to be seen, but this is unprecedented territory. It's never happened since German governments were formed post World War II. That shows how huge that development is. But it's certainly an indication that the people in Germany no longer trust Merkel, and the political system doesn't trust Merkel, because the reality is, if you read between the lines, they're saying there's no common basis of trust. That is the trust applies to Merkel, not the other, you know, discussion partners who forms this coalition government. They're in broad agreement. They just don't trust Merkel anymore. And then you look at France, and Macron has got huge problems. I mean, he's only been elected a few months ago. There's been this massive revolt of around 100 of his party members, where they criticised him for what they term broken promises. And again, that magical word, a complete lack of trust. And there was accusations from members of his own party that he used them as a tool to seize power. And members, as I say, have quit the party because they said the discussions were really just coming from the top. There was no discussion. It was just mandates for them to do X, Y, and Z. And the trust had completely broken down. Now, on the back of that, so he's got the internal problems politically within his own party. And then you've got these protesters who have been on the streets having anti-Macron rallies all across France. And this has gone on for 5 consecutive days. And the problem is, what they're principally furious about is that Macron's trying to bring about these controversial labour reform laws due to take effect in January of next year. And that law will make it easier for businesses to hire and fire employees and reduce the power of the labour unions. Now, you might argue that in principle they're not bad, reforms to make, but they're so deeply unpopular in terms of with the French people that the backlash is huge. And if you start upsetting the labour unions in France, you've got big problems. So what Macron's now, his approval ratings are falling off a cliff edge, the economy's nosediving. And he recently went to Athens, and he got a load of abuse, and there was violent protests when he went there, specifically against Macron. So we talk about this huge melting pot and this convergence of events. Well, Germany's an example. France is an example. Catalonia still kind of is not fizzling out. They've imprisoned half of the Catalonian government. The other half's in Brussels. It's a complete embarrassment to Madrid. And it's causing actually instability within the Belgian government. Now, what's supposed to happen is on December the 21st, the Catalans are supposed to have another poll or another election. But the question is, how are they going to vote for people who, of the pro-independence parties, are in jail or in exile? So it becomes an utter farce, and the Catalans are going, this election's just absolutely meaningless, because it will actually do nothing. All it will do is stoke up more tensions of extreme views on both sides of the fence between those who want independence and those who don't. It's just going to cause more divide and conquer. Well, probably that's the whole point of having this election. And whatever happens, the outcome of the vote, it won't resolve the crisis. And then Hungary just bumbles on. You've got George Soros is now publicly denounced the Hungarian government campaign against him, calling it distortion and lies designed to create this false external enemy. Well, the truth is Soros has been meddling in Hungary, and Orban and him are kind of almost at war with each other. Italy, things just roll on. There's the banking crisis, there's the migration crisis. You can almost telegraph Berlusconi might end up back in power. Italy's an utter mess. And Turkey, just the relations between Turkey in terms of and NATO have just absolutely disintegrated in recent days, because there was this, not exactly sure what happened, but Ankara withdrew its troops from the military exercises in Norway, and Erdogan announced his decision to withdraw 40 these Turkish servicemen from the NATO drills in Norway, because his name actually appeared on what was called an enemy chart. So there was a photo with Erdogan's name, and he was listed as a hostile enemy. And of course, Erdogan's gone, well, hang on, this is time for us to seriously reconsider our membership in NATO. And the NATO Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, apologized twice. And then the head of the Norwegian Defence Ministry expressed his apology and regrets. But it's the damage it's done. And it's kind of indicative of something we've talked about for a long time, that the rotation east would eventually see Turkey leave NATO. And I think this is just the excuse that Turkey needs. But if Turkey leaves NATO, NATO's finished. And then, of course, there's the whole birth of the European army, which people say is cabal, and it's not. It's not at all anything to do with the cabal. And then, of course, unfortunately, the US has to wade in with its size 15 boots regarding this matter, because the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the US Air Force, whose name's Heidi Grant, said that Turkey's acquisition of the Russian S-400 anti-aircraft missile systems will deprive Turkey of access to NATO technology, and it's going to lead to the adoption of other measures. What exactly does that mean? And that's really not going to encourage Turkey to want to stay part of NATO. And it's been a member of NATO since 1952, which was 3 years after the creation of it. And it's been, historically, it's been a very, very strong NATO member. I mean, we know why it was included. It was only, if Turkey had been anywhere else in the world, they wouldn't have been interested. But because of its strategic position in proximity to the Middle East and straddling Europe, that's why they wanted it to join. But that's another example of all these events unfolding. Now, there are just a few examples of things that have gone on in Europe. There's far more, but we're seeing this gradual kind of convergence, as we said, of events, which at some point these dominoes are all going to line up. Someone's going to tip one, and then the whole lot goes, and that's when we see the culmination of what I call this event-driven scenario. So what it means is there's a lot of things going on in the world that don't join up, but at some point all these things will join up and become obvious. And I think we're now reaching the point where there's no coincidence we're having chaos in Germany. There's no coincidence we're having chaos in France, as two examples. But it's the whole death of cabal globalization that we're witnessing. And I think that is why I made the Twitter comment, because we're actually witnessing that. And I think it's now irrefutable to anyone that is actually happening.
Absolutely correct. I mean, it's pretty monumental when you see a figure like Angela Merkel and Germany being not only the economic stronghold of the EU, but also the influence, and to see that their policies in regards to the immigration, everything that's occurred there has really been disruptive. And now we're watching a monumental shift that's occurring in Europe. So it truly feels, Len and Paul, as though the entire sphere of influence is changing dramatically.
Yeah, of course, absolutely. And then we can't kind of not go a week anymore, I guess, without talking about Saudi Arabia and developments there. Now, what's probably not necessarily obvious is the role that the UAE plays in all this, because we know that Mohammed bin Salman, who's the Crown Prince, we'll just call him MBS from now on, he was involved in this creation of the war in Yemen. He was responsible for the Qatar blockade. And then we've sort of latterly seen this issue with Lebanon. Now, essentially, he's been set up to fall by the Kabbalists, and they're using the UAE as this conduit. And the reality is, if he doesn't apply sort of corrective measures, then it will result in a pretty ugly outcome. So the reality is he needs to dump his advisors. He has advisors in the UAE, and he has close advisors in Saudi Arabia who are not working in his best interests. Now, at the moment, everything's in this kind of melting pot, and the longer it drags on, there is a risk that this ugly outcome could ensue. Now, ugly outcome could mean many things. However, there is some things we'll talk about in some detail shortly, which may lessen people's concerns about that. But what Middle Eastern nations don't realize is they're just pawns in the cabal's game to use at their disposal. Now, this shows the problems you have is you've got the Saudi foreign minister who urged all these Arab League nations to find this no compromise solution to dealing with this apparent Iranian aggression and disregard for international law. It's incredible how it's all suddenly happened in the last few weeks, and it kind of plays perfectly into the article I wrote about this false flag, and then you'll see more and more stoking of tensions and blaming everything on Iran's aggression. Well, that kind of simmered down because the meeting happened, and these nations were not interested in going to war with Iran for obvious reasons. And they've kind of downplayed it a little bit, although they're kind of sitting on the fence somewhat in that regard. But then, interestingly, and this was something that came out, and we talk about as much as we decry the UN, but there was a UN Nation Security Council panel that issued this confidential memo that essentially says there's no evidence to support Saudi Arabia's claims that missiles are being transferred to Yemen's Houthi fighters by external sources. Now, this assessment came out on the 10th of November, and this was in light of this, November of the fourth missile attack from Yemen, which targeted the King Khalid airport near the Saudi capital of Riyadh. And it was the first missile from Yemen to have reached deep inside Saudi territory. Now, the fact is, we've talked about this before. We did it on the round table thing. It was a false flag missile. It was never the Yemenis who did it. And in fact, it was Langley behind it and responsible. But it's interesting the UN have effectively come out and said, there's no evidence. We can't back any claims that Hezbollah gave the missiles to the Houthis, or this idea that the missile that was launched and they managed to destroy it, but they found fragments of it that had "Made in Iran" written on it. I mean, utterly ridiculous, nonsensical idea that Iran's going to put a missile and write "Made in Iran" or the equivalent on it. But this UN, it's just it's just so ridiculous. But this UN panel has said no, there's absolutely nothing to support it. So it's interesting the UN's backing away from, because they could have quite easily have come out and said, well, yeah, we have sufficient evidence to believe it was Hezbollah or it was the Iranians who provided the missile, but they've backed off and said no. Now, I always say this guy's name wrong or struggle with it, Hariri, who's the Lebanese deputy prime minister who basically resigned and created this whole kind of pantomime with regards to his anti sort of Iran and anti-Hezbollah rhetoric. Now, it's interesting there's been some big developments with him in recent days, which kind of suggests a massive climb down from Saudi Arabia, because he's announced he's going to return to Beirut on Wednesday. Now, The interesting thing is he said he's already resigned, but it's almost like he's talking about this kind of promise to discuss his future. And he said, I've resigned, but we'll discuss in Lebanon, um, and the need for me to meet with the president, that's Michael Anu, I think it is, before taking further steps. Well, if he'd already resigned, what's there to discuss? He's resigned. Now, what it looks is, if you look at his departure from Saudi Arabia, there seems to be some method in what's been going on, because it set off a whole sort of chain of events prior to him doing this, because there was a visit by what's called the Lebanese Maronite Patriarch. Now, he went to Riyadh last week, and it suggests that there was some negotiated settlement to this Hariri affair. And the idea was that, in essence, Saudi Arabia wanted some exit strategy from this debacle, because it's received enormous international criticism and ridicule. Now, the President Anun's public criticism of this, what he termed the alleged abduction of Hariri, is part of the problem. But what was quite astonishing is the greatest part was the backlash from the Lebanese public, including from what you would term traditionally loyal Sunni clans, who just bought into the abduction narrative. Now, note, they're in stark opposition to the Shiites, who are the Hezbollah in Iran. So effectively, the supporters of Hariri said, look, we don't agree with this. There's something just doesn't make any sense. Now, whilst the Saudis traditionally keep the sort of lines of communication open with this Maronite church, this patriarch's visit to meet King Salman is pretty unprecedented. And this patriarch also met Hariri in Riyadh. Now, what's obvious is Saudi were hoping to leverage this patriarch's influence to reach a new political equilibrium in Lebanon, and actually involving Hezbollah, not eliminating them. Now, Anun, who's obviously the president, he's a Maronite, and he's obviously got close ties with Hezbollah. So clearly the Saudis are looking for some political way to accommodate what's going on in Lebanon, but that will also effectively have to indirectly include Iran. Now, interesting, at the same time, Lebanon's foreign minister, unsurprisingly, went to Moscow on a working visit last Friday and met Sergei Lavrov. And Russia's response was interesting, because it talked about its unwavering position in support of the sovereignty, territorial integrity and stability of Lebanon, including the resolution of all issues on the national agenda by the Lebanese people through an inclusive dialogue, taking into account all the various political views. And they said there can be no place for foreign interference in the country's internal affairs, that could disrupt the internal balance, and Russia wants to preserve and see a strong and stable Lebanon. This was a very polite way of telling certain parties to back off and stop meddling in internal affairs. Now, interestingly, Lavrov also met his Iranian counterpart on Sunday in Turkey, when they had this trilateral meeting to do with the political process in Syria. And that's also integral to the future of Lebanon, ironically, given Syria's close proximity to Lebanon. And then we find that Hariri visits Macron. And we know, because France has had this interesting posture, which most European nations haven't, where in the post-sanctions Iran world, they are looking to invest a huge amount of money. I mean, the energy giant Total is involved in the development of this enormous South Pars gas field. And the car maker Renault is going to return to a production base in the country. So kind of interesting, he goes to visit Macron, bearing in mind Macron, for all the political rhetoric, is very interested in maintaining and building stronger relations with Iran. Now, what do we also find? Only about a week ago, Macron went to Riyadh. What was he doing there? And why is he going to have a visit to Tehran next month? So all these kind of convergent lines are coming together. And France has also come up with a pretty similar comments to what Russia has said, that they want Lebanon to regain its stability and to be protected from dangers that regional crises can pose to it, and from foreign influences, because the country needs to be a strong state. So pretty much France and Russia are saying exactly the same thing. And the reality is that you don't see any way that anyone really wants to go to war and have a civil war in Lebanon. And it looks, and can we say now that France won't liaise with Hezbollah directly, given the visit to Tehran? I think that's quite likely. And also, what do we see recently? There's been these huge discussions between King Salman and the Chinese President Xi Jinping. And China's intention is to have deeper cooperation with Saudi. Well, that'll come as no surprise. And yet China takes a very different stance from Western analysis, because a lot of the Western nations think that MBS is this hot-headed young lad who's kind of out of his depth. And China says, no, MBS's anti-corruption drive is a sign of these deepening of reforms, and they've praised him for his desire to destroy extremist Islam and return the country to moderate Islam. And they've taken an overview of the reforms as an attempt to sustain, the House of Saud and get rid of the difficulties it faces. And China upholds the view that they feel that MBS is authentic and he wants to genuinely shift power away from to moderate Islam. Now, what's interesting as well is that China also realized that the Saudis turned away from its traditional relations with the US and moved towards Russia, and hence we know the story with Salman visiting Moscow. For the first time, that strengthened relations with Russia. And it's clearly obvious that Saudi is now realizing that they're going to have to learn from this rash of idiotic insanity where they went to war in Yemen through very bad advice by the UAE. Then we had the Qatar, where we had that sort of ridiculous economic blockade. And they're now realizing, actually, ironically, both of these events has played into the hands of Iran and made them stronger in the Middle East. So they need to improve their diplomacy, and therefore relations with Russia is a huge step in the right direction to try, because they've seen the influence that Russia's had through diplomacy in the Middle East in the process. Now, it's no doubt that. Sorry, go on.
No, I was going to say that's a very valid point, but continue, please.
Yeah, so if we look at the relationship between China and Riyadh's very interesting now, because King Salman recently called Xi Jinping to congratulate him on what they term the successful completion of this Chinese Communist Party's recent Congress, which, whatever people's perspective, it was an astounding success. And Xi's commitment to Saudi is clear. They want to deepen and strengthen the strategic cooperation between the nations. They want to safeguard its national sovereignty and realize greater development. Now, China's saying we want to safeguard national sovereignty is a clear indication, because we know there's a coup attempt inside Saudi Arabia, which is why MBS has done what he has done. And China's giving public notice of the fact that they're not going to tolerate that. Now, how China deals with that is an entirely different matter, perhaps, than from the way Russia would deal with it. But it's a clear indication they're not prepared to tolerate it. They also want to advance the integration of the One Belt, One Road initiative and this Saudi vision of this 2030 plan. Now, also Aramco is an interesting part of this equation, because that is part of this reform plan for this Vision 2030 project, where Saudi wants to diverse its economy away from oil. Now, Salman has responded positively, that's the king, to the Chinese offer. Now, if that goes through, that in part will blow the doors off the petrodollar complex. Never mind the petro-yuan. But here's a nice little one-liner, but it's a bit of a bombshell. What's not known is Saudi is already trading in yuan for oil. They just haven't told the world, but they're already doing it. Petro-yuan already exists. And that's not something that's known, but there was something that was confirmed to me in the last couple of days. So I thought it was worth throwing that kind of bombshell in at this point in time. So
yeah, there's
affected. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, just in regards to and I don't want to break your train of thought because I know it's important once you get into flow to keep going.
No, okay.
But in regards to Aramco and the speculation regarding the IPO, there's been speculation stating that it's not going to happen. That perhaps they've already brokered a deal with the Chinese and the Russians to avoid an IPO. What are your thoughts on that, London Paul?
Yes, that's very possible. But certainly the Chinese are going to underpin this, and they may publicly say, we're taking a 5% stake, but it's probably going to be considerably greater than that. So yes, I mean, the IPO might not actually ever happen. And of course, there's this huge, and there's something we'll talk about shortly to do with Norway that ties in with the whole petrochemical oil and gas industry, which I think is highly interesting. So there's not much more I'll say about this segment, but I'll then talk about that and tag it at the end of this because I think it's quite interesting. But what it effectively shows is that King Salman's call to Xi is a deliberate signal by Riyadh that despite all the rhetoric and this posturing about Lebanon, Hezbollah, Iran, Saudi Arabia remains committed to this desire for moderate policies, and it doesn't want to trigger a regional war in the Middle East. And I think there are these competing factions, certainly within Saudi. One wants to retain the petrodollar, one wants the petro-yuan, one wants to remain, close ties with the US neocons, and one wants to tie with Russia and China. And there's no clear-cut solution, but from that side of the equation, they don't want to go to war because they know if they go to war, China and Russia will dump them. And that will be the end of the House of Saud. Never mind that the war itself would be the end of the House of Saud. And then all chaos will break loose. So they have a choice. And that's partly why they need to look at their relationship with UAE and go, hang on, what has UAE brought to the equation for the last 5-10 years? And it's nothing but trouble because the UAE has just become a mouthpiece for Washington, neocon, deep state cabal policy. And they're just using Saudi as a mechanism to be able to roll out their plan. But in the process, if MBS carries on, he will basically destroy his own dream and the House of Saud will be finished. And the whole Middle East then could and potentially would descend into chaos because who knows what the vacuum would be as a result of that. So it is a difficult situation. I don't think anybody particularly wants to go to war, but there is always the risk that things don't quite turn out the way you expect them to be. But certainly there's been a massive climb down over the Hariri and Salman's call to Xi, and also ongoing relationships with the Russian, and also the desire to kind of reduce the rhetoric. But there are elements within the Saudi government who will continue to stoke those tensions. But I think compared to when this whole story broke, the tensions are nowhere near as bad as they were then. But there's always the risk that you can never say never, and we have to hope that common sense prevails and it doesn't get out of hand, because it not only would it be a huge, gigantic sort of problem in the Middle East, it would push this event-driven scenario out by however long that might be in the process. So, and it's a last stand, and hopefully it's an utterly futile one with regards to the cabal, because they know the only thing they can do now is blame Iran for everything, and hence have a false flag. And you mentioned earlier to do with Hezbollah being fully aware of the risk of that. Well, it's a fact. That's all they've got left. Create a false flag event, blame it on Hezbollah, blame it on Iran, and use it as a way of instigating some kind of war in the Middle East or some sort of conflict. And the fact is, all these nations like Saudi should have woken up to this by now and realized they're just being played. They're part of a game, and they need to turn away from the game and say, we're not playing it anymore. We're not falling for this nonsense. And then that will be the end of that. Now, the point about this sovereign wealth fund in Norway is interesting, because the one thing that Norway did that the UK never did when we had all the North Sea oil was to create this sovereign wealth fund. Now, Norway's sovereign wealth fund's around $1 trillion equivalent there. And they've got this Norges Bank Investment Management Fund, which now contained within that is around $35–40 billion investments in oil and gas stocks. Well, they've just announced that, and this is the largest investment portfolio on the planet by some margin, is going to divest all its interests out of the extraction, processing, and sale of fossil fuels. That is pretty astonishing for a nation that produces oil, and it's taken its sovereign wealth fund and saying we're not investing anymore in petrochemical industries effectively. Now, why would they do that? They're either expecting a gigantic crash in the price of oil and the damage it would do to these businesses, but also are they diversifying because there's significant changes coming up in energy usage and consumption? And we're not talking about tomorrow or next week, but certainly in the future, in a kind of post-cabal world, that's very much going to happen. But it's an indication that they're seeing there's no longer any reason or anything attractive about being invested in, as we say, the extraction, processing, and sale of fossil fuels. I saw that as a hugely significant development that largely nobody would have even noticed. But for me, it's a very indicative of the way the whole petrochemical industry is going globally. And I think, and I've said this before, at some point the price of oil will crash. Okay, if the Middle East blows up, then oil will go to ridiculous prices in the opposite direction, and we could see anything like $100 a barrel or something. But I still retain the expectation at some point the oil price will crash, and $20 a barrel is what is being projected for quite a long time. We almost hit it back in, was it January, February 2016, and then it all kind of fizzled out. But very much if the economic downturn happens in the way we expect it to, then the price of oil will crash to that. And I think that's partly the reason why this sovereign wealth fund have decided to renegotiate their position in terms of their portfolio and gone, we're getting out of the oil and gas sector.
Right. Yeah, the falling prices, the increase in production, Iran bringing their oil line in, and also I truly believe that there's also a lot of concern in regards to new sources, new energies coming, the technology advances that will be happening in the next 10 years as well, Paul.
Oh, undoubtedly. Well, Russia has cold fusion and it works. I mean, Russia's need for the oil and gas industry was just to serve a short-term purpose. It was actually to allow them to sell enough oil and gas to invest in all these future technologies that they've been working on for some time. And they have these technologies that are really already workable. Now, there's an argument between being workable and rolling it out, domestically or internationally, but they certainly have huge amounts of advanced technologies that they reinvested the money from oil and gas for that very purpose. And I come back to the point, I've said it many times, Medvedev said there'll come a point when the Russian economy will no longer be dependent on oil and gas. And he said this and everyone just ignored it or dismissed it. But he said it for a reason, because that's precisely true, and that's exactly the way the Russians are moving toward. So you're absolutely right. Alternative energies will certainly come about, and there's a lot of idea where people think there's all this Star Trek technology coming around. It's not going to include that. I'm not saying that's not something that will happen eventually, but in the short term, there'll be a movement towards coal fusion energy, which will give us huge amounts of very cheap energy in the process. So it will start to revolutionize the energy sector. But we have to be a little bit careful we don't get carried away too soon with the idea that these incredible technologies are going to get rolled out domestically and internationally, because they just don't have that scalability at this stage. Even though on a small scale there are people who have developed free energy technology they can use in their house, but try and roll that out domestically and internationally, it's a very different story.
Right, and that'll be important for the developing nations as well, and the ones that really, in particular, struggle with the infrastructure. I think that's why the Saudis, MBS, see the amount of reform that's needed in Saudi Arabia and how quickly they need to do it to remain in power. There's very little other industries there, and that's what you have to be very careful about, is that the act of desperation that could occur. So it's going to be interesting to monitor and watch events unfold, Paul.
Yeah, absolutely, and that is true. Saudi's move is they realize that their dependence on the oil sector is a folly, and they can't continue, and they're not going to wait until the oil industry sector dies and then they return to desert essentially. So they have to diversify. it's a tall order. It's going to, but with China's help and the One Belt, One Road, they can achieve it. But it's like, again, rather like we said about Trump. Trump went home with 250 billion notionally of deals, but the strings attached, and it involves you need to play ball with us, work with us. Fine, we'll help you all we can. If you don't, we'll destroy you. And the same goes for Saudi Arabia. They start meddling, doing ridiculously stupid things in relation to Lebanon or other nations. Ultimately, would be hugely detrimental to them. And you know, MBS and knows this. He's aware of this. But like anything, the problem in nations is like Trump. Trump has played this, well, effectively he's had a war with the deep state, the cabal in his own nation, who's thwarted him every end of turn. Well, in essence, MBS is in the same position where, although they've taken a more obviously sort of draconian measure in purging the Saudis and removing people from office, and it's now including the military personnel apparently as well. So they have a very different way of doing things, which Trump obviously can't do. But there are similar problems, and that's what happens when you're trying to turn a nation around with huge cabal influence. It takes a long time. Now, the one thing that Saudi Arabia is trying to do is compress it into a very short space of time. Likewise, Trump trying to compress it into a short space of time. What Russia and China had the luxury of is spending years removing that cabal influence out of their nations, and it's taken a heck of a long time. But they had the luxury of time on their side. Saudi Arabia and the US don't have that same luxury, so it makes things very much more problematic for both of them.
Yeah, when you haven't involved yourself the past 12 years of regime change and endless wars, you have some time to focus on other things, Paul.
Well, yes, exactly. But actually, something that came up that's interesting. I know we've spoken a huge amount about the whole Russophobic, Russiagate nonsense, but what was interesting came out in the last couple of days was, having spent over a year, looking at this document known as this Trump dossier. It turns out that the US Department of Justice and the FBI appear to be unable to verify any of the claims that it contains. Now, this probably won't come as any surprise, but how this came about is the US House Intelligence Committee subpoenaed the FBI and the US Justice Department on August the 24th, demanding that any documents, if they exist, that detail the Department of Justice and/or FBI efforts to corroborate, validate, or evaluate information provided by Steele, who wrote the dossier, and/or subsources and/or contained in the Trump dossier. So they really covered everything off. And neither of these agencies have provided documents in response to this subpoena. So the question therefore comes about, well, if there's no substance to this, what the hell is Mueller investigating? And why is this investigation carrying on? Because the US House Intelligence Committee should be turning around going, well, you've not produced the evidence we asked for via the subpoena. This should be the end of this investigation, because there's nothing else to investigate in this regard. Well, that's my take
Yep.
on it anyway.
No, and I'm very excited to watch some of the players fall in this entire bogus narrative, including a senator who is needs to retire is John McCain, and I know that he has caught himself in a very tough spot, and I'm excited to see him go down with this as well, Paul.
Well, yeah, anybody, whoever it is, who's involved in this whole process, if they're guilty of things, they need to be adjudicated accordingly, and that's part of this what I call the Operation Dragnet. This is enormous, far and wide. Now, I know there's been a huge amount in the alternative media, and we've spoken about this before, to do with indictments. There is a lot of substance to it. I think some of it maybe has got blown a little bit out of proportion, but in essence, there is substance to suggest this. But it doesn't mean there's going to be arrests tomorrow, next week, and we don't know who's going to be arrested, how, why, and when. But ultimately, if the dragnet does its job properly, all the people involved, including a lot of the usual suspects and people we understand to be involved, are going to get caught in that dragnet, and they will get adjudicated accordingly. However, don't be surprised to see names appearing that no one will have ever heard of. No one will turn around and go, who are these people? And actually, you'll find out they were very much masterminds in the whole process, and I expect we'll see quite a bit of that, and there might be some names that will surprise people. We might actually find some names that we expect to see in there don't appear in there equally for very different
Yes.
reasons. And I think there will be people entering. I'm not talking about depending on people's position in the hierarchy, there will be people undoubtedly looking for plea bargains. They'll sing like canaries, give all the information, and if they can indict 20 other people further up the food chain, then maybe deals will be struck. I don't know. I'm not saying there is. I have no way of knowing if that's the case. But it wouldn't surprise me if that turns out to be what will transpire. But for sure, the dragnet's in operation. Is part of this draining the swamp, and it's part of the plan B. And I said way back in the podcast that plan A failed. They couldn't do it internally. Certain people would leave the White House. You'd see plan B start to unfold. And in the ensuing months, that's precisely what we're seeing. And that's why we've seen this massive escalation in the US in terms of what's going on, and why we're seeing this desperation. I mean, the desperation, we talked about the whole Russophobic thing, is now extending to China. All of a sudden, China's on the radar. China could be involved in this. China could be involved in that. The panic that's ensuing inside Congress, inside the Senate, inside the Washington Beltway, and the intelligence agencies, etc., is enormous. And that's why we're seeing all these crazy knee-jerk reactions and people making the most ludicrous, ridiculous comments because they're so frightened. They're just lashing out at anything and anyone to deflect, the people's criticism, deflect the eyes away from them, because they know the dragnets is closing in on them.
Absolutely. Paul, any other closing thoughts? Also, please take a moment to share with our listeners how they can learn more about you, your wonderful work at the Sirius Report. So please go right ahead.
Well, I thought we closed with something that I actually put on Facebook group this one that amused me, and it just shows the crass ineptitude. Obviously, to do with Brexit, we're not going to discuss Brexit because it's all just hot air and irrelevant. But what's amusing is they've got this idea that in a post-Brexit world, all the EU citizens here are going to have to be documented and all their information taken down, blah, 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 blah. Now, what's interesting is Home Office officials in the UK have privately admitted that the department's having problems increasing its immigration staffing levels as part of these Brexit preparations. And this is the bit that cracked me up. They may have to recruit Polish and other Eastern Europeans to help register the 3 million EU nationals in Britain. So Britain's leaving the European Union. It's going to recruit people who actually should be on the register. So what are they going to do? These people are going to be processing their own applications whilst they process everyone else's. It's absolutely ludicrous that, how can you have a situation where that happens? And it just shows the farcical ineptitude of the United Kingdom and how it handles Brexit, when it has to recruit the very people who should be on the register to do the work on the register, because apparently no one in the UK wants to do it.
Nice.
So I kind of thought that was something that amused me, but it just amuses me because the whole Brexit thing is an absolute farce. Although the only thing Brexit is good for is it was kind of a catalyst in this event-driven scenario, which saw the beginning of the end, of the European Union. So for that much, we should be grateful. And it is. I mean, I've never voted in my life, but it was the one election that I went out and thought, well, if I vote because I want Britain to leave the European Union and it succeeds, then it actually will achieve something. I didn't expect it to achieve what everyone else thought, because I didn't see it in that way. But I thought it was something worth voting for because it actually was going to have a decisive outcome. Okay, if Britain had stayed in, then it wouldn't have had the outcome I wanted, but that's democracy. Despite the fact that so many people foaming at the mouth in Britain because the vote didn't go the way they wanted to, which are clearly not understanding what democracy means. So I think it was a very important vote, and it will have very important ramifications for Europe, but not in the way that all these technocrats in Europe and all these politicians in Britain are slugging it out and foaming at the mouth about Brexit without realizing that Rome, Paris, Berlin, and every other European capital is burning, metaphorically speaking. And
Right.
that's just the part that amuses me. But yeah, in terms of what we do, it's obviously the SiriusReport.com. That's SIRIUS. Lisa has done a huge remake of the website. We've had a lot of positive feedback. I think she's done a sterling job. It looks great. It's yes, we'd like people to subscribe to our premium content, the podcast subscription series. It's $4.75 a month. We think it's very good value, and we've now done 291 episodes. So, which is quite a lot of back material. We've had odd people who've joined in the last couple of months who've actually gone back and listened to everything, which is incredible given the amount of content that involves.
Wow.
But yeah, we'd like you to join that. We've got obviously the Facebook page, which we utilize, and then there's the Twitter account at the Sirius Report. And thank you to everyone who has subscribed. We'd like more people to subscribe because it allows us to do more. And obviously, as ever, we always thank Rogue Money, because in the last year they've got us well known in areas that we weren't previously, and as a result of it, we ended up going on the X22 report, which we're going to do soon when time permits, because there's a huge amount of things I'm trying to deal with. It to do with personal matters. But when we get around to that, we'll do that again. But thanks, obviously, to Rogue Money, because they've been a great help to us, and we really appreciate it.
Very good, Paul. Thank you. We're honored, and it's a great pleasure to have you. So, for our fans, thank you for listening in today to another Sirius Report with London Paul. Please check back with us at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We have another show yet to do today with Charles Hugh Smith. So this is London Paul and CJ, and we're over and out. Take care, everyone.